In this video, you're going to learn about the key transaction assumptions behind our more advanced LBO model. Now, in contrast to most of the tutorials in this course, the transaction assumptions are actually going to be quite similar to what we saw in our more basic LBO model. So we're still going to have a share price, we're still going to have an offer price per share, we're still going to have an amount of debt required, equity required, and so on. So it's going to be fairly similar, but we will do a few things differently. And so that's the purpose of this video, to point out the few differences and how oftentimes in LBO models you don't exactly follow this template that we laid out before for the transaction assumptions. So as I mentioned, we're still going to have an offer premium and an offer price per share. To keep this model consistent with the other one where we had a 20% offer premium, once again I'm going to say 20% for our offer premium. And so that will give us an offer price per share of the 192 times this 1 plus 20%. So we get, again, an offer price of around $230 per share. As I mentioned in the more basic LBO videos, the offer premium, the price that we're paying for this company, you would determine this by looking at a valuation very similar to what we did for Apple. Actually, going back to our valuation graph, you would create something like this to establish a range of different possible values, and you would normally pick something in the middle for your baseline assumption. In this case, if we were being more conservative, it looks like $200 per share is roughly in the middle of this range, so we might pick something like that for our baseline assumption here. So we have that. Now for the equity purchase price, once again, I'm just going to link to our diluted equity value. This, remember, is based on the purchase price of 230, not the share price of 192. Now the enterprise value, I'm going to go to the bottom here under purchase price calculations. For the EBITDA purchase multiple, the idea here is the same. For an LBO, the EV to EBITDA multiple is the most important metric to look at for this type of transaction. So we're always going to look at it, and we still want to be basing the EBITDA exit multiple roughly on what the EBITDA purchase multiple was. So we're going to take the enterprise value right here, and then go down to our income statement, and divide by the 2009 EBITDA. For this calculation, remember that we're always looking at the most recent historical EBITDA number. We are not going to base this on forward EBITDA numbers unless it's very close to the beginning of the next fiscal year. In this case, we're assuming it takes place at the end of 2009, beginning of 2010, so we're linking it to the historical 2009 number. Now for the debt required here, we're going to do something slightly different. In the other assumptions, we assume that debt was a percentage of the equity purchase price, so 50% in this case. But actually what normally happens in LBO models is that instead of assuming a percentage of debt, you assume that the debt has a certain leverage ratio. So you assume that the company can take on a certain amount of debt in proportion to its EBITDA. So one way to think about it would be to look at this EBITDA purchase multiple and then to say, okay, we're paying 13 times EBITDA for the company. Of that 13 times EBITDA, how much of that should be debt and how much of that should be equity? So should it be 10x equity and 3x debt? Should it be 6x equity and 7x debt? So that would be one way to think about this. And that's how you often hear private equity guys and investment bankers talking about LBOs. The terminology they use is turns of debt. So they might say, okay, so can we support 3 turns of debt, 4 turns of debt, and so on. And the turns of debt is really just referring to the leverage ratio. So in relation to EBITDA, how much debt can this company take on? Now in this case, once again, to determine this number more precisely, we would look at public company comparables and specifically debt issuances, debt comparables, to see what recent debt issuances have been issued at, what kind of leverage ratios we've seen. In this case, we don't have that data, and actually even in private equity interviews or if you're asked to build a model, they're not going to expect you to have that data. So normally you just pick a reasonable number and then again build a sensitivity around it. So we're going to say 6x here for our leverage ratio, which means that the debt required will be the 6x right here. I'll scroll down to get the EBITDA times the 2009 EBITDA of 13 billion. So we have 79 billion worth of debt. Comparing these numbers to our basic LBO, we see that we're raising quite a bit less debt in this case, but that's okay because actually the assumptions here are more realistic. 6x is still quite high for a leverage ratio on an LBO like this, especially for such a huge deal. And once again, to be honest, this deal could never actually happen in 2009 or 2010. And even if a larger deal like this were to have happened, we would see a much lower leverage ratio. We might see something like 2x or 3x for a very large deal like this. So with the debt required established for the equity used, we're just going to take our equity purchase price and then subtract the debt required. So we get 133 billion of equity. Now for the EBITDA exit multiple, again, we're going to base this roughly on the EBITDA purchase multiple and the public comps. As with the basic LBO model, we're just going to say 10x for this one because once again, we're going to build a range of sensitivities around this. So the exact number here doesn't matter all that much. Now for the advisory fee and financing fee percentages, these work the same exact way as what we saw in the basic LBO model. We have to pay M&A advisors, other parties who are advising the companies a certain fee. We have to pay anyone who helps with raising debt a financing fee on that debt. So we're going to go with the 0.02% and 0.06% for financing fees. One new addition here is legal and miscellaneous fees, and this is because normally in LBO models, you take into account the bank's M&A advisory fees, the financing fees, and then the legal, accounting, and other fees all separately. In the more basic model, we just lump them all together, but actually they would normally be separate items. And unlike advisory and financing fees, normally legal and miscellaneous fees, you just pick a round number for these, an absolute value rather than a percentage, and you base it roughly on how big the deal is. So a $1 billion leverage buyout is going to require much less legal work than a $50 billion leverage buyout. And that, likewise, is going to require much less in the way of work than a $200 billion leverage buyout as we have right here. So I've just said 10 million for the legal and miscellaneous fees number. For this one, again, you'd have to go to law firms that you're working with or other advisors that you're working with and see how much it would actually cost, but that's typically how you set up this assumption. You pick a absolute number for the legal and miscellaneous fees, and then you make the advisory and financing fees a percentage of the deal value or the debt value. So that's how we set up our basic transaction assumptions for this more advanced LBO model. Again, very similar for the most part to what we saw in the more basic LBO model. There are only a few differences here, but the differences we do have are quite important, especially the leverage ratio here, setting it up like that versus assuming that the purchase price is a certain percent debt and a certain percent equity. Coming up in the next lesson, we'll be getting into the debt assumptions, and this will be one of the key lessons in this course because the debt that we're going to use is going to be more complex than what we saw in the more basic LBO model, and we'll have to get into some of the differences between different types of bank debt and different types of high yield debt. So that's what we'll be doing in the next lesson.